Khamzat Chimaev is a Swedish professional mixed martial artist and freestyle wrestler who competes in the UFC welterweight division. He's also a three-time Swedish national wrestling champion. Now, Chimaev is trying to rise up through the ranks of the UFC, and while he does have his fans, he certainly has his share of critics. So stay tuned and don't go away, because we're revealing what people are saying about Khamzat Chimaev. First up, what happened at UFC 273? You're about to find out. At UFC 273, Chimaev and Gilbert Burns fought in a welterweight bout that ended up becoming a Fight of the Year contender. Fellow fighter Darren Till thinks that Gilbert Burns is the best thing that ever happened to Khamzat Chimaev, and despite winning the fight by unanimous decision, the fight was an uphill battle for Chimaev, who took 118 more strikes than he had during his previous 4 fights combined, and even went down in the second round. And according to Till, Chimaev's pal and teammate, the overall experience of slugging it out with Burns was precisely what the fledgling fighter needed. In a recent interview, Till said, "The best thing I think for this fight is that Chimaev tasted a bit of getting punched and having to dig deep for the win, because that changes you as a fighter, as a man." Till spoke with Chimaev backstage and told him that the Burns fight was exactly what he needed. Wrestlers typically aren't accustomed to taking repeated strikes to the head or upper body, so now Chimaev knows what to expect in future matches. Till also believes that Burns' fight will cause Chimaev to train even harder. Like Till, former middleweight contender and UFC analyst Brian Stan was just as impressed by Chimaev's performance. But as you're about to see, not everyone is convinced that Chimaev's got what it takes. Next up, is Chimaev just another hype job, or will he deliver? Let's take a look. After the Burns fight, it became clear that not everyone was impressed with Chimaev. Many were saying that Chimaev is all hype, and UFC president Dana White took serious issue with that. White argued that anyone thinking Chimaev was all hype was out of their minds. Like White, Till thinks that those who are criticizing Chimaev's performance against Burns are being ridiculous. The next fight for Chimaev seems to be against interim welterweight champion Colby Covington. White has confirmed that he's still looking to set up a Chimaev versus Covington matchup, and said it would be the perfect headliner for a UFC on ABC card later in 2022. Till is convinced without a doubt that Chimaev can punch his way to a title shot and would like to see him fight Covington in a 5-round main event. Till thinks that Chimaev has what it takes to not only beat Covington, but knock him out, because Covington hasn't felt power like Chimaev. Till maintains that Covington is an exceptional fighter, but doesn't think he is fighting the best talent, with the exception of Kamaru Usman. Chimaev has come up really fast, but nevertheless, Till is confident that Chimaev has a ton of power and an edge over Covington. Hopefully, Chimaev can defeat Covington, so he can get his title shot against Usman. Up next, what drastic measures will the UFC implement after Charles Oliveira's chaotic UFC 274 weigh-in? Let's take a look. UFC President Dana White said that the UFC will hire a security guard to stand watch over a scale that the UFC calibrates, similar to the scale used by the State Athletic Commission that oversees the event. White said that the non-US fighters have altered the UFC scale used at UFC 274, which may have resulted in inaccurate readings. Although it doesn't seem like there's anything nefarious going on, the issue is that fighters will come out and start checking the scale the night before weigh-ins, and European fighters from other parts of the world do kilos, and according to White, start messing with the scale. Apparently the scale has a number of moving parts, and that is why White wants to hire security personnel to watch over it, so no more tampering can take place. It all started after Oliveira was stripped of the title when he stepped into the octagon on Saturday, May 7th, for being a half-pound overweight in the 155-pound lightweight title fight. Oliveira beat Justin Gauthier in the first round, but because Oliveira had been stripped, he was left with the #1 contender spot. Oliveira swore that he made weight the night before the official weigh-ins, and said other fighters have had issues with the scale, adding that the UFC scale and the official one were different by about a half pound and up to 2 pounds. Flyweight fighter Matt Schnell said on social media that the UFC warned fighters that the unofficial scale was off, so maybe Oliveira didn't get the memo. Stay tuned and don't go away, because we're revealing the latest UFC news. Next up, what happened with Esparza versus Namajunas at UFC 274? Let's find out. Carla Esparza's title fight and win over Rose Namajunas was one of the worst championship fights in UFC history. For many observers, the fight was incredibly bad, a real snoozer that saw just 67 combined strikes landed over the course of 25 minutes. For whatever reason, the girls just didn't want to turn up the heat, but in the end, the scorecard led to a split decision in Esparza's favor. It was clear that Namajunas failed to capitalize on key moments that could have won her the fight. She just failed to deliver. Congrats to Esparza though, who set a record for the longest gap between title reigns in UFC history, and no one can take that away from her. But the UFC isn't exactly happy to have Esparza, their new strawweight champion, winning in such a boring way. Why? Because the UFC doesn't like their fights to be snoozers. They like bangers, and Namajunas is the more marketable star, while Esparza on the other hand doesn't have nearly the same amount of star power. But as any UFC fan knows all too well, star power doesn't win fights in the octagon. Just ask Conor McGregor, one of the UFC's bigger stars and controversial figures, who was TKO'd twice by the shy, quiet Dustin Poirier. Up next is Tony Ferguson's future in UFC coming to an end. Let's take a look. At UFC 274, Michael Chandler delivered a vicious knockout to Tony Ferguson that quickly put him to sleep. This was a crushing loss for Ferguson, but let's be honest, he hasn't looked good in his 3 previous fights, and expectations for him overcoming Chandler were already low before he stepped into the octagon at UFC 274. Ferguson fans were feeling confident during the first round of the Chandler fight, especially after Ferguson dropped Chandler and seemed to control Chandler on the ground afterward. Ferguson even landed some nasty elbows on Chandler that opened a fresh cut under his eye. So for the first 5 minutes of the fight at least, fans were confident that Ferguson had Chandler just where he wanted, and that victory was imminent. But as we know, in the UFC, things can change as fast as a roundhouse kick. 17 seconds into round 2, everything changed into Chandler's favor after he landed a brutal kick to Ferguson's chin that was felt across the arena. Instantly, it was lights out for Ferguson, who is now on a 4-fight losing streak. Throughout Ferguson's career, he had never been dropped like that, and for a 38-year-old fighter, such a nasty knockout can often change not only the trajectory of their career, but end it altogether. Fortunately, Ferguson was released from a local hospital with a negative CT scan. However, it's still possible that the damage is already done. It's difficult to predict what's next for Ferguson. He'll no doubt need to unwind for a few months and refocus himself, but it's unlikely that Ferguson will want to go out like that and be remembered in such a way, so chances are he'll be back for another fight. Finally, did the UFC just ban flags in the octagon? Dana White has confirmed that UFC fighters can no longer carry flags into the octagon. For UFC fighters, celebrating in the octagon with their home country's flag is nothing new and a source of pride for many fighters. But now that's all coming to an end. No more flags during walkouts and no more flags in the cage. The UFC's long-standing tradition of fighter portraits with their flags is also over. So what gives? During a post-fight press conference at UFC 274, White explained his rationale for making the decision to ban flags. When asked by a reporter it was true that he had banned flags, and if so, why? White replied, "You guys know why. Let's not even play the effing game." Normally, White isn't afraid to tell it like it is, but in this case, he tapped out and dodged the bullet pretty quick, which left many observers wondering if some country the UFC is working with has an issue with a certain flags being aired on broadcasts, or if the UFC's parent company, Endeavor, was the problem. Or was it possibly ESPN or Disney? The UFC may have chosen to ban flags to avoid offending authoritarian regimes, or to avoid controversy if Russian fighters carry out their flag because the country invaded Ukraine. The flag ban seems like a move designed to depoliticize the sport in these turbulent times. That's a wrap for today's video. Thank you for watching.